Team Facebook friends on this Zoom. That's exciting.
Jessica, are we ready? Are you ready for us to go?
Yes, I'm ready on this end. I think Emmy's still doing a couple of things on her end.
Okay.
Okay. And Emmy, you just want to give us the green light when you're ready.
I am good to go.
Okay. And your video's off, just FYI.
I'll have it on in 1 sec.
Okay.
Okay, great. I'll get us started then. It's 1 minute after 12. So good afternoon to those who are joining us. For those I don't know, my name is Bridget Blum-Ramsey. I'm the president and CEO of the Pritchard Committee. And I want to welcome you to this Lunch and Learn today, which is part of the second week of our annual meeting, which we're holding virtually, of course, entitled Education Excellence and Equity in a Changing World. Today's Lunch and Learn will explore a Coping with COVID study, which members of our Student Voice team have led and designed. So we're anxious to hear more about what they've learned. Today's session is part of a series of virtual events. In the chat box, you'll find a link to our webpage where you can register for additional meetings through this Friday. And tomorrow evening, we have a special conversation on Facebook Live at 6 o'clock Eastern with Dr. George Wright of the University of Kentucky about racial equity and justice. This will be streamed live, and we'll take comments from those listening in via Facebook comments. Please note we are live streaming today's session on YouTube to easily archive the discussion, and we encourage each of you to use the chat box to post your comments and questions, and even simply to say hello to each other throughout the event. Also in the chat box, you'll find a link to a survey with questions about needs in education. We'll be using the results of this survey to populate the Pritchard Committee's next multi-year strategic plan. So I encourage each of you to fill out the survey so your voice can be part of our planning. And without further ado, I'm going to turn this session over to Rachel Bellin, our Senior Director of Student Voice at the Pritchard Committee, to get us started.
Thank you, Bridget. As Bridget said, I am the Senior Director of the Pritchard Committee Student Voice team, and I have to use the word senior to distinguish myself from the Student Director, Emmy Sippy, who I'll be passing this off to in 1 second. Senior in this case also means elderly, relatively elderly. So as our team gets ready to share the results from this ambitious student-led student research today with you, we want our listeners and participants really to get ready too. And specifically, we have 2 requests of you. As you listen and engage, we first hope you consider whether and how what you're about to hear about Kentucky students statewide might apply to those in your own community, and how the voices and statistics the team shares might help inform decision-making in your own sphere of influence. It's really important that with this work, we unleash local energy in finding solutions to and through the COVID crisis. Secondly, and at least as vital, we hope in the brief time with you today, you will consider the power and potential of student-led education research. And with that, it's all yours, Emmy.
Thanks so much. It's really, really great to be with all of you today. I am just going to turn it to our next slide and want to note as we begin that we're in the midst of these 2 pandemics of COVID-19 and reawakening around systemic racism, and wanting to frame our work today in the context of these compounding crises, noting that The students who you'll hear today and our adult allies are representative of a much larger group of young people who put in hours upon hours this summer working tirelessly to make this study possible. And then we also want to note that those of us in the room are a subset of Kentucky students, and that there are so many folks who have not been able to share space in these kinds of ways, and that as we do our work, we constantly want to make it possible for more young people to be a part of co-designing their education and doing community organizing the way that we get to. So with that, I will just pass it to our team to introduce ourselves. As Rachel said, I'm Emmanuel. It's really such a joy to co-direct the team with her and work with the rest of these folks, and I will pass it off to Krupa.
Hi, I'm Krupa. I am a senior at the Gatton Academy right now. I'm super excited to be here to be sharing what the Student Voice team has been working on for almost 4 or 5 months now. I'll pass it on to Svandana.
Hi, my name is Spandana and I'm a sophomore at DuPont Manual High School. I've been working on open response question and interviews with this survey, and yeah, I'm really excited to be here. So I'll pass it off to Pragya.
Hi everyone, my name is Pragya Upreti. I'm a junior at Lafayette High School in Lexington, and I've also been working on the qualitative analysis of a specific open response question that we've disseminated through this research, and as an interviewer and analyst in the second part of this study.
Hi, my name is Gloria. I am a senior at the Carol Martin Gatton Academy, and I'm working on the quantitative side of this study and also as an interviewer, and I'm really excited to be part of this revolutionary work. So you may be asking yourself, who is the Pritchard Committee Student Voice Team? Well, we are a group of about 100 students who are self-selected, range from 13 to 21, and strive to amplify, elevate, and integrate students' voices across the Commonwealth. Now, this brings me to what we do. There are so many different things that we do that if I were to list them all, we could be here all day. But to give an overview, we share students' stories, support students as partners to improve Kentucky schools, and act as a youth arm of the Pritchard Committee. We've conducted school climate audits, we've led teach-ins and rallies at the state capitol, testified in front of various legislative groups, and penned co-ops, reports, and even wrote a book. So how exactly do we amplify student voice? Well, we use the tools of civic engagement to elevate the voices of young people in education decision-making. Whether that is through conducting education research studies, making speeches and presentations, testifying, producing a blog and podcast, or even creating press events, we believe students are a largely untapped resource when it comes to improving our schools.
So when we think about student voice, we tend to think of it on a spectrum, recognizing that there are more meaningful expressions of student voice and less meaningful expressions of student voice, but that all of them are valid. We tend to see expression as the most common form of student voice, that young people, this often looks like young people holding up signs and protesting. And part of how I like to think about this spectrum is moving from a kind of protest to policy making. And so when we get into levels like consultation, this might be a focus group or a survey, but students are still operating within an adult's agenda, not co-designing what that process is, and they are relegated to one piece of it. In presence and participation, there's more collaboration, but yet again, students are not fully partners in the process. When we get to these higher levels of partnership, activism, and leadership, students are truly co-designing, and we see our study as one exemplar of what that might look like. And so in part one, we had about 9,500 responses all 120 counties represented and 119 fully. And now that we are embarking on part 2 of this study, the interviews, it's also important to note that we are working our numbers up on that front with thanks to many of the partners on this call. And so as we kind of delve into the results of this, we want you to be thinking, as Rachel said, about what resonates with the students you work with or folks in your communities, and how this might be relevant to you.
So our first major theme surrounded the abrupt shift in our education environments. And so in the education environment realm, we've seen a stark trend in the meaningfulness and manageability struggles that students have been experiencing. Several students reported a drastic decrease in the manageability of their coursework, as shown by the graph on this slide, with 32% of all students experiencing a decrease in manageability. A similar trend was seen in education meaningfulness, motivation, engagement, and just a critical understanding of their learning. Some of these experiences may have been inevitable. You know, we know better than anyone that it's difficult to stay engaged and attentive over Zoom and other online platforms. And on top of that, with the loss of social contact, it's understandable that many students would experience difficulties in staying involved in coursework. So with regards to manageability, students are often reporting having to take on increased roles within their household, as evidenced by one student's experience on the right. And these have largely shifted how much work students perceive as manageable. And students are also experiencing a decrease in their self-perceptions of meaningfulness. Throughout the short answer responses that we've analyzed, many students reported feeling that their content was no longer meaningful due to the crisis surrounding them. And so, although a large number of students expressed that they were intrinsically motivated to learn through remote learning, and they genuinely cared about the content that they were learning, their workload wasn't aligned with this desire. And so, put simply, students struggled to find the motivation to complete, engage, and effectively manage less meaningful work. And so in our study, another realm of a student's education environment was illuminated in our quantitative and qualitative analysis, which was teacher communications. And so as you can see by the graph on the screen, student respondents reported a correlation between decreasing frequency of teacher communication and a large drop in their motivation and engagement. So 65% of students reported their teachers communicated with them less than one time per week, consequently reported a decrease in motivation, as opposed to the 55.3% of students whose teachers communicated with them 2 or more times per week. And so our short answer responses illuminated that students showed that with the loss of an in-person school community, they wanted to shift from more logistical to meaningful communication. And so put simply, frequent and meaningful communication was seen as a vital pathway for teachers sharing empathy and care for their students. And so this brings us to the policy recommendations. And so I think it's important to understand that our findings serve as a strong foundation to inform recommendations that influence schools, districts, our Commonwealth, and even just our classrooms. When we consider the evidence surrounding perceptions of meaningfulness and manageability and teacher communication, we offer the following suggestions. 1, teachers and students should be encouraged to work side by side to create classroom policies that support students in varied home environments. And 2, in order to make this a reality, teachers should feel empowered to create and implement feedback mechanisms that allow students and parents to share their voices in the forms of surveys, personal check-ins, and built-in reflection periods throughout the school year.
Yeah, thank you for that, Pragya. And I think that discussion around the findings of education environment flows really nicely into our next realm of findings, which was the home environment, because something we've seen throughout this study is that the line that was once there between a student's education environment and their school environment has become incredibly blurred. And one of the ways that we defined their home environment throughout this was their access to technology. Something we found throughout our survey was that poor and working poor students were disproportionately more likely to report having unreliable Wi-Fi access, with 7.2% of students reporting never having access when compared to their more affluent peers. And additionally, rural students were 3 times more likely to report never having access to reliable Wi-Fi when compared to students in metro areas, which was 4.4% compared to 1.4%. This is important because students with greater Wi-Fi access report feeling more motivated and that their work was more manageable and meaningful. So access to Wi-Fi can really impact a student's perception of their education, especially in this moment of crises. Access to reliable Wi-Fi was also linked to time spent on their schoolwork. Students who were reported never having access to reliable Wi-Fi were more likely to spend less than 1 hour per day on school than students who had more reliable access. Students who had more reliable access to Wi-Fi also tended to report higher levels of motivation and work manageability. The next realm that we defined home environment in was students' changes in their employment and their basic needs security. Employment has been changing for both students and their caretakers during this pandemic, which has been affecting their home life and thus their education life, with 13.3% of students having less work during the pandemic, but 9.8% of students having more work. And nearly 1 in 3 students who have had parents who have lost their hours. And it is these students that are having more financial worries and are more worried about school. Students who took on more work were the most likely to spend less than an hour on school per day. And students, the whole sample study found that 16% of students were more worried about money and 5.6% of students were more worried about food. And these numbers are more than double among poor students. And I think this little blurb from a student on the side really highlights the root of how students are feeling in this moment. And then another realm that we defined home life as was home responsibilities. And I think Pragya touched on this a bit, that students are taking on a lot more responsibilities throughout this pandemic, with 60% of students reporting doing more cooking and 70% of students reporting doing more cleaning. Additionally, we've seen a gender disparity in taking on these home responsibilities, with female students seeing a disproportionate increase in responsibilities compared to male peers in all of the responsibilities we surveyed except for farm work. When we look at socioeconomic status, while students of all SES statuses tended to have some increased responsibilities, poor and working class students were more likely to have taken 4 or 5 increased responsibilities as opposed to 1 or 2. In addition to that, poor and working poor students were more likely, were the most likely of all the socioeconomic groups we surveyed to report feeling safer at school rather than at home. Most students felt the same level of physical and emotional safety at school and at home, but poor and working poor students were the most likely to report a decrease in physical and emotional safety. With that, we considered a couple of recommendations based on our findings. One, that schools should implement more flexible attendance policies to consider student responsibilities and barrier to remote student attendance. And 2, just the general idea that a student's basic needs must be met during this pandemic and in all moments in education, including their psychological safety.
So moving into physical and mental wellness, we found really stark, again, discrepancies by socioeconomic status. A greater proportion of poor and working class students reported feeling more depressed after COVID-19 than before compared to their middle and upper class peers. And these quotes really exemplify this finding. One you can see says, "My parents work in 8 to 5 hour job every day, so I stay home by myself. Not being around my friends, family, or peers as much as I was before COVID-19 has drastically affected me and my mental health." We know that students are facing increased obligations on many fronts and that they need support in multiple spheres, particularly from schools, in order to learn at the same levels or as meaningfully as they were in the building. When we go to our next slide, we are also thinking about emotions and how they connect to responsibilities. So students who felt their schoolwork was more meaningful also had more positive emotional changes. Students who spent less than 1 or more than 5 hours per day on schoolwork on average had more negative emotional experiences than students who spent 1 to 5 hours on schoolwork. So we definitely want to keep the amount of work manageable, but also want to note that when it's more meaningful, students' emotional response is likely improved. Overall, there was a 50%, over 50% increase in the number of students who wanted but lacked access to mental health services. We know that this was highlighted in many of the responses to our question about the primary challenge students were going through right now. For instance, the one on the screen, making sure my family stays healthy since my mom has to work every day is their primary challenge. And food has obviously been one component of stress on students that we want to work to address. Our recommendations in this sphere are that we
appreciate your persistence, Randy.
we provide robust mental health services through schools and decrease the student to counselor ratio. We want to create infrastructure for teacher training and social emotional learning. And remember the importance of socializing during school, especially now. Give young people opportunities to be with each other as human beings, not just working with each other on a project, but really spending time with each other, connecting, because that's something that we are obviously lacking considering the COVID restrictions.
Thank you, Emmy. So now we're going to discuss our final theme of future plans. So this question was a lot about seeing how the impacts of COVID-19 have translated to students' futures after high school. So the pie chart shows us that around 1/4 of the thousands of respondents were expecting a change in their future plans. Within the students that have expected change, something that's concerning and also of note is that over half of those respondents expect that change to be a negative one, while only 18% expect that change to be positive. So students mentioned a wide range of categories in their different responses. 4 of the most frequently mentioned categories, as you guys can see here, were post-secondary, uncertainty, employment, and mindset. Respondents who were categorized as post-secondary often mentioned different financial, academic, and physical barriers that were standing in the way of their post-secondary plans that they previously had. For example, those whose sports seasons and extracurriculars were canceled are now concerned with their inability to be eligible for competitive athletic and merit-based scholarships. Respondents mentioned inability to get summer jobs, which would go towards tuition. So all these issues led to much uncertainty, which was also a frequently mentioned category. This uncertainty is even more heightened for those students who are approaching the time where they need to start making these decisions about, like, some of these very important decisions about their futures, such as juniors and seniors. As for mindset, respondents mentioned more stress and less motivation. The uncertainty, along with the changing mindset, kind of dealt with the loss of resources that would normally be available in an in-person school environment. So these are things like getting college and career advising from trusted adults. Leading into employment, some students wanted more stable jobs, like jobs that would be considered essential. And some of these students were more inclined to go into the medical field because of how useful and honorable it is, while some were more on the opposite end of the spectrum, saying that there were safety issues. So this quote on the right shows uncertainty, the financial barriers, and the importance education has in continuing those post-high school plans. So students didn't just mention immediate employment concerns like parental employment or their employment to pay for tuition, but just kind of changes overall in their future career paths. So what I mentioned earlier, like whether a job is essential and stable, are kind of making students reconsider their future careers. So many students have backed away from the careers that they've wanted to pursue because education is tied so closely with those careers. And there have just been so many barriers to accessing post-secondary education, like I mentioned earlier. Family financial issues were really like another barrier because they're not sure if they can reach their career goals without further education, which can be affected by the new financial circumstances during this pandemic. To move on to policy recommendations, we see that things were pretty urgent, and supports in addition to the education that school provided were kind of taken away from students. So supports like counseling, mental health, and all of these students' uncertainties of financial aid, standardized testing, etc., were really worsened by the lack of the supports that counselors, advisors, trusted adults could provide. It's imperative that we urge policymakers to consider emphasizing and integrating post-secondary advising in a remote setting. And it's not just about integration of this post-secondary advising, but also ensuring that the post-secondary advising is accessible.
So now we want to delve in to this data with you a little bit more, and I can stop screen sharing and share our executive summary in the chat, or if somebody else has that link on hand, so you can see this data as we're discussing it. A couple of the questions we want to throw out to you are up on the screen, but don't feel like you have to stick so closely to them. We just love to hear what's resonating with you. And what you might consider taking back to your job, communities, thinking around how we address these crises and support students.
Thank you all for this really beautiful presentation and all of your really, really hard work. One thing that pops out from your data is the piece around, I'm really biased towards thinking about rural internet. I live and work in Appalachian side of the state. And I just noticed that when we think about the stark reality of how many kids have never had internet access, I think about how they've just gone so long without meaningful social interaction in that format. And what we are seeing here is in Letcher County, about a third of students are showing up for online school. So when you just think about 2/3 of students not being there, I think there's not a lot of necessarily, that I've not yet seen creative approaches to trying to solve that problem. And it appears that it will be a problem for quite some time. So I'm curious if you all, to Bridget's excellent point in the chat, have you seen any creative or meaningful solutions to bridging that internet gap?
That's a question for the team. Stephanie?
If they are open to questions, yeah, I'm just.
Yeah, we totally are. Pragya, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I think, well, and I think that just to recall correctly, the question was about like the digital divide, essentially, correct? And how
are there any districts that are creatively or effectively handling students who are not showing up?
Yeah.
Largely internet issues.
So something that we kind of took into consideration within our specific realm of study within ORQ question 1, which was on teacher support, was just this idea of the dissemination of resources at this time, and specific district reports we don't have on hand right now. But I would say that a lot of times this was a direct result of maybe not having the right processes in mind to be able to implement these strategies within our schools and our classrooms. And a lot of times we think back to this idea of like, sometimes we don't always need a policy to change the way things are. And it starts, in the classroom. It starts with a teacher's willingness to adhere to the changes that we're going through right now and recognize that obviously, the education system that we thought was once so finite is not anymore. And we're seeing its fragility in this moment. And to be able to address this issue of the digital divide, I think we're in this moment, we're starting to see how pivotal it is. Like obviously internet in and of itself is a big thing when it comes to virtual learning or just working virtually in any case. But I think out of anything, the one takeaway that we have from this study that kind of relates to that is just the fact that so many of these issues that we're seeing are a direct result of how this pandemic has just illuminated the inequities that have been so consistently part of our education system for so long. So it's not, I guess it's not safe to say that this pandemic has created this issue of the digital divide, instead of just, recognizing that a lot of these things have been ingrained within our education system, and we maybe haven't been paying as much attention to them as we probably should be. But yeah, definitely that's been a really big takeaway that we've gotten from this study as a whole, is just recognizing this changing period that we're in and how we can address further inequities within our education system.
Thank you. That makes a ton of sense.
Thank you for that question, Stephanie. We do have a few more in the chat.
Yes. In terms of counselors, Spandana, since you worked very closely on the future plans question, I'm wondering if you want to take a stab at that question around scholarships and the need that students are having.
Yeah, for sure. So let me get that question pulled up. Okay, so within the responses that we looked at for that future plans question, a lot of students were saying that it felt like it was their primary responsibility to seek out those college scholarships, apply for them. So a lot of students mentioned not really knowing how to go about that process and feeling kind of just really lost with the loss of supports that counselors could provide. And as for how it is now, I believe that many students were really worried about their sports seasons being canceled. And I know in some schools in some parts of the state, those are continuing. So that could possibly help with, being eligible and being able to qualify for those athletic scholarships. But I'm a sophomore, so I don't really interact with my counselors a lot, for college yet. But so I'm not exactly sure how they're helping like juniors and seniors who are having to start like making those decisions and apply for scholarships really soon. But yeah, a lot of students mentioned that like needing counselors was a really, really big aid to them in applying and being eligible for these scholarships.
Mary Gwen, I'm wondering if you have anything to add to that answer, working with students as long as you have in Jefferson County area, and helping them, supporting them to make the transition to post-secondary. Did she just pop off?
No, I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Okay,
here.
sorry.
Yes. Yeah. So, the thing I'd just want to share is that in Louisville, we have announced a 2-year tuition-free promise scholarship for the class of 2021. So that's a great boon to this class, and we're furiously raising money so that can be extended to the whole high school. So at least to have the 2-year any KCTCS institution and Simmons College as an option. But I think, generally, I was just sitting here thinking, are there sort of general online resources that everybody should access? Certainly, Kia has a tremendous number of online resources that could help, and I think helping to spread that. I think really the challenge, everybody's trying to figure out, how do you reach people when there were, high school offices or college centers or things like that people could walk into, and now how to get to those. So I think it's got to be a very intentional outreach is what I'm seeing us happening now. So.
Thank you for that. And we'll note too, that scholarship that you mentioned in Louisville is a huge deal, and you had a lot to do with it. So I'll blow your horn for you.
Thanks.
Any other questions? And I'll note that as we move into the interview process, we've conducted, I think, about 20 at this point. We are getting more updated information about some of the themes and the questions that were asked in the initial survey. We're able to delve more deeply into them, and we know that for many of us, we were in a really different place in May when this survey was disseminated, and we expect that the respondents have likely, their feelings have likely shifted. And so we hope to give even more updated information in light of this process as we move forward.
Yeah, and to add on to that, we have like specific questions in our interviews about future plans and those supports that students needed. So it kind of gives us a more recent picture of what those supports are looking like, and whether with maybe, because I know in my school, like this NTI 2.0 has a lot more structure. So I feel like I can contact counselors and different adults way easier. So with that additional structure, we get a better picture of whether students are able to feel supported when they are looking for scholarships or making those decisions about their future plans.
And we can keep taking questions, but I'm wondering, Krupa, if you want to move us into this reflection process. We're hoping to give you a little bit of a look at the behind the scenes in a way, thinking that our product is really important, but as we like to say, the process is a huge part of that. And we want to showcase, just some of our thoughts and reflections about how we've engaged in this work.
Yeah, and I think a great way to start that off, or start that reflection process off, would be to maybe just ask the students involved in the survey, or in the analysis of the survey, if there were any stories or moments of when you were working on the survey that you really felt like you connected with the data, and how that impacted your perceptions of analyzing the data and sharing it back. And I'd love to hear from anybody on this.
I can start. And I guess the one thing that we want to say as, we kind of delve into the second phase of the study is just the idea that, we always come back to the notion that, we're students too. And as student researchers in this process, it's obviously been such a rewarding and humbling experience to just sit back and listen to those that we often kind of overlook in a situation like this. So I would say above all, in terms of connecting to this data that we've analyzed, we felt heard. And hearing from our students and the students throughout the study, and looking at them as peers in this process, a lot of the struggles that they talked about were things that were echoed by the experiences of us, and we related to them to some extent. And I think that kind of grounded this entire process with the idea that students have such an important stake in improving our education system at a time like right now. And even as we sit here and recognize our position of privilege by just having a seat in this discussion, I think we've really just come to terms with just how much each of these results mirrors the experiences that we dealt with as individuals.
Spandana or Gloria, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to echo everything that Pragya just said. This study is like the beacon to everything Student Voice is about, amplifying students' voices and hearing what they actually have to say. And as we're moving on during our study and conducting interviews, it's really interesting to see the more emotional part of the students' responses, because analyzing the data was one thing, but then putting the human aspect into the interviews was a whole nother thing. And it was really interesting during my first interview because it really put into perspective how COVID is really impacting students. I really thought that students, I don't know if they would say like situations are improving in schools, but they've started to accept the fact that things have changed and things might not go back to normal. So we're all working together as students and administrators to like create an environment where students can actually thrive during this time of COVID-19.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Gloria just said. And I think as we move into the interview process, we're seeing this whole other realm of connecting with students and connecting with the data that we're finding that I think is really a really wonderful perspective to have when we're analyzing this data. And I think this flows really nicely into another question I've been grappling with lately is how have your own experiences differed or mirrored the trends of the data that you've been analyzing throughout this process? Does anybody have any specific instances or general comments about that?
I think as a whole, like I was saying before, we obviously have connected with these experiences that students have been discussing. But I would say above all personally, and I'm sure for our entire team, it's just been a really eye-opening experience. And, we've obviously recognized, the position of privilege we have in this seat today, but throughout this research, we've often come back to this notion of how we've come out of this bubble of me and into this realm of we, and understanding that we're in a collective and we hear the stories of these students, and we recognize that the 5 of us here today as student researchers can't simply just portray the experiences of each individual student of the 9,000 plus responses that we received. But as a collective, I think we've really come to terms with how we can do our part in amplifying the voices of these students who've been most marginalized in our education system, and just how that's been further illuminated through this crisis. But I would say in terms of personal experiences, a lot of what's been driven by this research has just been the idea of connecting with the students that we've been hearing from, and not separating their experiences from what we experienced, but using what they tell us as a means to improve and now shape the policies that our classroom should have, and just our entire Commonwealth as a whole, and how we can really use meaningful student voice in this moment of crisis.
And I'll add that I think we went into this wondering about how there's this kind of dissonance between education and learning, and that we learn from cooking, from cleaning, from community organizing, that obviously we are privileged to be able to be a part of something like this, but that lots of students, I would say every student, is doing something outside of school in their day that they've learned from, that the school system itself doesn't largely give credit for or see as a form of learning. And so I think one thread throughout this process has been exploring what it might look like to redefine education, to better reflect that we learn from so many things, including traditional classroom learning, but also far beyond.
I think that idea of revolutionizing what we consider as traditional learning has been something so impactful throughout this process of the pandemic. If as we're talking and discussing this reflection period, if any good questions come about, I'd love to see those in the chat, whether they're regards to the data or just the process in general. But also, I think another important part of this project has been the intergenerational component of the work that we've been doing. We have both student researchers and more professional adult allies on this team. And I'd love to hear from both the students and our adult friends that are on the call, how has been working with, for students, our adult allies, and for adult allies, the student voice team, impacted our perceptions of research around education and policymaking when it comes to education?
So I'll start as Daniela and Sammy and Beth might be thinking. The intergenerational component of this work has been critical to it. And it's not your typical mentor-mentee relationship, I would say. From what I've seen, and I've been able to be a little bit more objective because I'm not part of the main research team, there's been, the roles have been very complementary. There have been times where adults are learning from students, students are learning from the adult research team, but also there have been times where the students have define their boundaries and have told adults what they need and ask them politely when to step back. And the adult research team, as I've observed, have been so responsive to that. And it's created this pretty incredible dynamic and learning experience for everybody. I'll segue into any of the adult researchers who want to speak to that.
It looks like Daniela may be in motion at the moment, so maybe I'll start and then turn it to her. It's, I think we've all been learners in this process together, which has been truly remarkable. And it's also been a reminder that we can have really rigorous research, mixed methods, qualitative, quantitative, on many different levels that that are enriched. Enriched doesn't even capture it. That are made valuable because it is peer-to-peer research being done. So as the adult allies on this, I think many times what we've learned most from is in being able to listen to the student peer-to-peer conversations and analyses that are going on for insights into where the analytic depth and the insights lie in these data. We might be able to help them think about some of the processes for working with data, but they are the ones who have really brought the insights to how to, what important interpretations lie in it.
Yeah, I agree with Beth that I think a really important part of this project, for me, sorry, I just sit down a lot. It's 7 a.m. for me, is the ability for students to do this work with support from adults, but not as much support as I think outsiders would think. And that students are able to conduct rigorous research without, with just a little bit of help from adults and a little bit of training, like Beth said, around guidance and providing support for when they need it. And I think that is the important part of this work, is that students are capable of doing this, and we just need to allow them the space to do that.
If any students want, oh, good.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, I don't have anything more to add than that, than Beth and Sammy, but it's just been a pleasure. And I'm so excited to actually be getting into this next round of interviews as the students start to speak to, because I think the interviews that are coming through are really wonderful, and both what we're learning from what other students are saying and from those experiences of peer-to-peer interview themselves, I think will be a really nice addition to what we've already learned.
And just, I think one thread that's been mentioned a few times is this peer-to-peer idea. And I'll just share a little bit of background that our team has. This coping with COVID study came out of school climate audits that we've been doing for a few years now, thinking about democratizing research and giving students agency over data in their own communities. And that has really informed this process.
I would say also to just amplify what everyone's been saying, but also as a shout out to all of our adult allies in this process. None of this would have been possible without their assistance and advice through everything. But I would say from a student perspective, this experience as a whole has just shown us the power of meaningful student voice and just this important nature of intergenerational partnership within that. And so I think right now, we all feel like so much is at stake. And, you know, we're seeing, once again, our education system, that something that we always felt was so finite at its most fragile state. And so, you know, this is the time when whenever decisions at this scale are being made, we need to ensure that we're hearing the voices of those impacted most directly by these decisions from both students and educators and adults in this process. And so I think not just from students like us at this table, but you know, who've taken it upon ourselves to speak up in this time, but also from those who you maybe wouldn't see otherwise in this position. And so I think we've all really just as a team, we've come to terms with just how much is at stake in this moment, and just, you know, in all of our educational trajectories, that we're using this time to just amplify the importance of listening and learning, and then changing during this time, and not sticking to the way things have been in the past. But none of this would have been possible without this intergenerational partnership, and recognizing that students have so much to bring to the table, and adults do likewise, and they have the insight that they gave us throughout this entire study and are continuing to give us to help us further this research.
If I could underscore something that Praga just said, just to keep in mind that when we first started this research, and I say we because I really feel like this is an amazing intergenerational team here. It was, as I recall, we were thinking we would reach our goal if we could get 2,000 responses to the survey, right? And we got over 13,000 responses, of which close to 10,000 were complete, clearly from student responses. It's just a testament to how important it is to students to have an opportunity to participate in both expressing their experience and having a role in shaping policy going forward, as well as to this group of what it took to shift our expectations of what our summer work was going to be in order to analyze those almost 10,000 responses.
And 21,000 open-ended responses, right? Can you all speak to, there's some really good points being made in the chat. I want to underscore what Mary Gwen just wrote there, so take a look. But I also did want to raise the question, we have qualitative and quantitative research teams. This has been a mixed methods approach. It's been very important throughout the work, and that's been a theme throughout all of the student voice teams work for years. Can you articulate why that is so important to you and to us? Why is this mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative data collection and analysis so critical, and you're not privileging one over the others, and you've been adamant throughout the whole process that you don't want to privilege one over the other? Can someone speak to that? I'll call on you.
I can talk a little bit about that. So I think something that like shows that both like quantitative and qualitative are so important and equal to each other is the idea of statistics and stories. So the statistics are like, majority the quantitative team, they focus on that, and it really gives us like kind of a picture of how many students are going through this, how many students are dealing with this. But then the ORQ responses, the open response questions, give us that like peek into the specifics. And then interviews, which are also another really important aspect of the qualitative research, have really allowed us to hear students' stories and get the stories behind those numbers in quantitative. So they're so important to go along with each other. And I just think that when we're presenting, giving the statistics and then supplementing with stories is just a really effective way of telling what these students have gone through and painting that really clear picture of the situation.
Yeah, and to add on to that, it's sometimes easy to forget that we're more than just students, we're also human beings. So I think the quantitative side of the data really shows the student body as a collective and can drive the initial policy making decisions. But then the qualitative data really brings it to the next level and makes the policy making decisions more meaningful and more driven towards what the students are actually experiencing versus what like the general trends are. So I think the qualitative really adds on to the quantitative in that way.
And I'll say one thing that kind of exemplified what Gloria is saying for me is we were in a meeting one day for our primary challenge question, and one of the student researchers that we've worked with, Connor, was talking about this idea of students as people. And that phrase really struck me because for a long time we've said students as partners, largely meaning partners in decision making around our education, but it's equally important, and it's crazy that we have to say it, but so vital that we're noting just the fact that we are people, the fact that we're juggling other responsibilities outside of school, the fact that we have home lives, and particularly now that can't be separated from our school. And so when we're talking about our communities and we're talking about society, we really want to work at the intersection in strengthening the relationships between schools and communities. And I think this has cemented that desire for us. And we're so glad to, I think, have the data to support that, that work and have it inform our action.
I would say also going off of that, my team was the teacher support team with ORQ question 1. And a word that we've kind of always brought up within our meetings is just this idea of nuance. And I think, from everything that we've gathered from this data, we wouldn't have been able to get that with just quantitative data. And of course, quant data is so important to, like Gloria was speaking to earlier, policy making is obviously at the forefront of our minds, but speaking to everything that we've been talking about now, it's important that just because there may not be an overarching policy that gets made maybe in our favor, it's important that we're looking at the qualitative side of things to try to see how we can implement changes within our own classrooms, often without the use of a policy, and just with the recognition that, like Emmy was saying, students are people, and changes need to be made based off of the situation that we're in. And it's not safe to say that, just because things were the way they were back when COVID didn't exist, means that things can stay the way they are now, which it's not true. And so we've really seen that illuminated throughout our study with this, distinction between qualitative and quantitative data, and just how the two of them can interplay in this moment, and how we can now inform changes that are shaped around individual student experiences.
Yeah, and I'd just like to underscore how important and how cognizant we have been about sharing back our data with keeping this mixed methods approach in mind. And to go off of that, I think I'd love to address something that was brought up in the chat a bit ago. How have we been sharing back this data with district and school leaders? If somebody wants to touch upon that.
Sure, really quickly, we started by presenting to the Kentucky Board of Education, and then we also presented to the Joint Legislative Committee on Education. We have sent co-op reports to co-op leaders throughout the state. We're finishing up the last 4 co-ops, I think, this week. We've also sent some reports to high participation districts, like Boone County had their own report, and we will be having some more engagement with community members and fellow students in thinking about how this data informs our priorities moving forward and our collaborations, particularly working with teachers to support each other, knowing that our interests are mutual interests and that we truly can collaborate to address this moment.
Going off of that, I would also say that a lot of times, when we think about the data set that we have with so many students, it's easy to think of, presenting to the higher up people, because that's where our mind goes to, when it comes to policy. But to Emmy's point about that, with looking at educators as, our interests are mutual, and we're just here to illuminate findings that we've seen that we think that often are overlooked, and especially now in this moment. But we've also spent time, talking to educators and making sure that they're aware of these changes, and being cognizant of the fact that they have their own experiences that they're going through, and recognizing that, this is the perfect chance for us to be working as partners, and recognizing that whenever it comes to policy, a lot of times it's just a mutual thing, and it's, understanding that we're all going through a really tough situation, and in order to effectively get out of this and change our ways of working from before, it takes listening to one another. So educators and just community members at large have been a really big part of presenting this data to, beyond just, the higher ups that are obviously involved in a lot more of the policy side of things.
We're also sharing this with other youth-led and adult organizations. We're in a community of practice through our grant from the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. We collaborate with the other grantees in a really powerful way. And I think that has been one really key kind of exploration for us in thinking about how this research process is also informing a change in terms of how we view student engagement. Again, when we think about that spectrum, student involvement can go so far beyond a protest. And so some of the groups that we're working with who are doing other civic engagement work around unemployment benefits for students, around housing and voting, we get to share this data with them and really bring another perspective around what student voice looks like. Any last thoughts from our group before we just give a few thank yous and pass it back to Bridget? Awesome. So yeah, we really just want to thank so many people. It is hard to start, but I am navigating these windows. Okay. We, of course, want to thank our parent organization, the Pritchard Committee, for making this work possible and supporting us. We value our collaboration so deeply. We also want to thank our partners at UK, National Geographic, Pathway to Tomorrow, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, Project Aware, Teach for America, particularly Teach for America Appalachia, if you're still on here, Stephanie, Kiska, that really helped us, and the why with dissemination. And with that, you can find our blog, our podcast, and our social media at these places. And I'll just pass it to Bridget.
Thank you, Emmy. I was having to find that mute button again. Thank you all to the Student Voice team for this incredible work and the information that it can and does provide to local communities and local schools to make more informed decisions as we go through this protracted experience with a global health pandemic. So we look forward to more information from the interviews as you continue down the path with those, and really infusing what you're learning with the greater push and commitment the Pritchard Committee has had for the last few years around re-mobilizing citizens for better schools. So just want to underscore again a quick thank you to some of our members who were on this afternoon: Mary Gwen Wheeler, Billy Harper, Wynn Radford, and Joe Harper, a brand new member of the Pritchard Committee. So we look forward to getting some of this information into your hands as you make the case for greater student agency locally. Student Voice team members, thank you so much for this continued work. And with that, at 1:01, we'll go ahead and sign off and hope that you all will join us tomorrow for a conversation about higher education during our Lunch and Learn, and then tomorrow evening for Facebook Live Innovations with Dr. George Wright of the University of Kentucky to talk about racial equity and justice. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.